But for me, it's a rather simple matter in the sense that really all I have to do is just get up here and basically remember, just to tell you a story, basically. Several stories, but all of them connected with the life of someone who was very, very influential in my life and in the lives of a number of people, particularly in the Chicago area. A man by the name of Bill Lawrence, who was, certainly later in his life, he was a member of the Theosophical Society. But he is, in fact, one of those people who was able to utilize the gifts that he had in a way that was of great service at a very needful time in many people's lives. That said, just a little bit of background about Bill, who later we came to know as the Old Man. I'll tell you about that as well. But, just the short background story on him, he was one of these people who had, at birth, some rather exceptional qualities, which perhaps, all of the different things that we may try to develop. At birth, he was one of these people who had this sort of clairvoyant ability. I mean, that's something they started noticing very early in his life. There's this old wives' tale that talks about children who are born with what they call a cowl over their face. I see people nodding, so many people might have heard that. But the idea that certain children, when they're born, there's this flap of skin that they have that's sort of covering their eyes like a veil. And old wives' tale about that is that that's something that seems to indicate some sort of other way of seeing. Well, he was one of those people that had that. The only other person I'd heard talk about that was a past president of the TS, Dora Kuntz, who said that she, in fact, was born with this cowl and the old wives' tale surrounding it. But as a young man, he was a person who was born into very, you would say, non-theosophically oriented family, nothing to do with psychic abilities, nothing like that. Central Illinois, and we're talking about, the 20s. He was born like around 1919, something like that. Coal mining town, Georgetown, Illinois. To this day, it's about 3,000 people in the whole town. Everybody knows each other. But he's born in this little town, and very soon, he started to become aware that the way he was seeing the world was, in fact, very different from his friends and people around him. I mean, he was always seeing things that were about to happen. And he was one of these kids who was out of place for the time. Because certainly, I think there's enough gray hair in the room to recognize a time when children were supposed to be seen and not heard. That's no longer the case in my family, but there was a time. The good old days. But in his case, he came up in those days. And being the impetuous sort of person that he was, he'd see something and he'd often talk about it. Now, first of all, I have to say I'm going to be telling you a number of things. And a lot of these stories I came to hear, either through the Old Man or others. And when I would hear them, I'd say, this, I don't know about this. I grew up in New York City. And, you don't have to grow up in New York to hear a whole lot of tall tales. But, you hear a lot of tall tales. And, I had this habit of saying, I don't know how true this is. Over the years of being around him and seeing the various people who were parties to these stories come in and out, gradually I started to find that these fantastic stories were in fact true. And so I just say that as we go along. So he would tell these things that he saw. I mean, for instance, he said there was one woman in their town who came to visit one time. She walks in, all he sees is black around her. He shouts out, "Oh, this woman's going to die." That got him a quick backhand, And sure enough, goes home, nothing wrong with the lady that they knew about. She dies, heart attack. Another time, there was a woman, I remember his sister telling me about this particular one. Nobody liked this lady. And she came to the house to visit. She was always kind of mean to the kids. And back in that day, they would do the washing with the washboards. So they would wash with the washboard, and then you dry it out in a wringer. So he's looking at her and he says, this mean old lady, she's going to get her breast caught in the wringer. And, again, that was another backhand. But sure enough, she goes home and says, oh, your son cursed me. But all that sort of thing was going on all the time. And it got to be rather problematic in his family. Because certainly, as I say, this is Georgetown, coal mining town. And here's this little boy talking all of these wild things. And to add to it, from time to time, he'd get mad at his parents. He said, you're not my parents. I'm from Tibet. He did say one of the outcomes of his unusual behavior was that it drove his father to try and learn more about this problem child. His father ended up being by the end of his life, quite a student of metaphysics as a result of his son. So that was one of the outcomes. But, all of these things would happen with him, and he would, gradually he got to the point where he started to become rather aware that, again, the way he was seeing things was not what his friends were seeing. And he started to try and kind of cover it up. It started to seem like it was more of a problem than it was a blessing for him. And probably many people have some experience with that. So he started to try and do that. One thing I should say, because somebody just asked me, what are you? And I don't think, we're not, when you hear that, normally we're not talking about the soul within us. So Jean and I were sharing our lineages. The old man was someone who looked, to look at him, you would think he might be Sicilian, he might be Native American. He was this real American hybrid. His mom was half African American, half Indian. His dad was half Indian, half English. And here he came out with this jet black, straight hair, these very sharp, aquiline sorts of features. But, if you were to ask him what he is, he'd say, I'm black. African American would be the word today. But to look at him, the look wouldn't tell you any of that. So anyway, he's growing up, and gradually he's trying to submerge these sorts of qualities. And he came up right at the time, he was of age at the time of World War II. So it wasn't something that he really looked forward to going into. He wasn't one of the ones that enlisted, he was drafted. And assigned to, as the military was composed in that day, all black units. At that time, it was a segregated military. Rose to the position of first sergeant. So I know there are people in here who are military background, so you know the functions of first sergeant. That's the kind of go-to guy with the men. So he was first sergeant, and some years later, and of course you hear all these stories about the war, but many years later he had a get-together of all of the men that were still alive from the war. And I got to hear a lot of these war stories rehearsed all over again. But all of them were the same age, but for whatever reason, they looked at him as if he was a father figure for them. And all of them said that they had gotten in some very tough situations during the war, but that they would always watch him. And somehow or another, they'd come through. In fact, one of the things that he said, during the war, you get a lot of these, what they call 90-day wonders, is it? The people who have been through the academic training but don't really have their feet on the ground out in the field. And they would be giving the orders to the men. So he'd tell them, look, it is 100% forbidden for you to retreat. He said, watch me. And when they said when things would, these 90-day wonders would order them into these areas, he would take his men and lead them. You know, they'd watch him and he'd lead them safely through. So he passed through the war, and you know, hearing Ed Tick talk today actually connected with a few different things that I hadn't really thought about in that way. But I know he described how when he got back from the experience of World War II, and he was in Northern Africa, Southern Italy, France, he talked about how when he got back, you know, you're given your stuff and everything's supposed to be all right. And he said how he came to Chicago. He'd left Georgetown. Came to Chicago, and he said he was just out on the street and a car backfired. You know, that sound. And he said he thought everything was fine. He was going along well. Next thing he knew, he was huddled, diving over into a corner for safety on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. So he knew there was some work for him left to be done. But he was this very unusual person in the sense that he had this always had this charismatic personality. And when he got back from the war, he's in a situation where it seemed like anything that he would touch, it would turn to gold. He started a business, and you know, the business would thrive. And then, almost as predictably as it would thrive and he would start really flourishing, money flowing in, something absolutely unexpected would come along and it would be lost. And he'd touch something else and make another fortune. Touch something else and make another. He was just in so many businesses at different times, all of them making money. But you know, the way he described it, at that particular point in his life, you know, really, there was something more for him to do than just make a dollar. But he was a very strong-willed person, and he was willing to will his way through this thing and neglect this sort of spiritual calling from his youth. But things kept happening to him. I know Buckminster Fuller made the statement that for some of us, all it takes is a touch of a feather, and we get the message. We turn our lives over. And he said for others, it takes a Mack truck. The old man was of the Mack truck variety. So things thrived for him. And I remember his sister telling the story about, at this particular time in his life, he had yet another successful business going, this time in Joliet, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. A number of grocery stores. And he had a time in his life where this kind of clairvoyance that he had tried to suppress somehow was bubbling up to the surface. I mean, he just could never fully get away from it. So at this particular time, he had these stores. And he described how above one of his stores, he had made this huge kind of apartment and outfitted it. And he would come home so tired that he would just lay down to rest in the middle of the day. And his sister was living there with him. And the way she told it, he used to come home and rest. And there was this particular music that he really liked, organ music. And he'd put this organ music on, and as soon as it would go on, bam, just like that, he'd go out to sleep, or he thought it was asleep. The way it turns out, one day his sister was wandering through the house, and Sis had a habit of she would talk to herself when she was asking herself about something, and she had lost a ring. And she's walking through the house, mumbling to herself about, where did I put that ring? Gosh, I can't, it's here somewhere, where did I put the ring? So she said she walked by Bill's room, and she's muttering this thing about where did I put the ring, and she hears him say, look behind the dresser. And so she turned, she said, what'd you say, Bill? And he's fast asleep. But, just to give it a try, she goes over to the dresser, pulls it out, looks behind, and sure enough, here's the ring. And, just for me, the way I visualize this thing, it's almost like in a comic book where she finds the ring and bing, a light bulb goes off over her head. What happened next, he would continue to come in. Whenever he'd come home, his sister would say, "Bill, you look tired. Let me put that record on for you." And she'd go straight to the phonograph and put the record on, and then, unbeknownst to him, she's getting all the information. And it got so good to Sis, she started to call up her friends and say, "Look, Bill should be home soon. Give it about 10 minutes, and then come on in. You can ask him anything you want." And so he'd be laying there, and they'd be getting all of this information. So he says, for some reason, he doesn't know quite why, one day, he had come back in tired as usual. His loving sister put this music on for him. And for whatever reason, he said he woke up. And he said when he woke up, he looked up, and all he could see, it was like a ring of faces around him. All of them leaning over just like that. And this one woman is screaming at him, "Bill, don't stop, don't stop. You were about to tell me what my husband is doing. Don't stop." After he threw everybody out of the house, he said that was the most wonderful moment that could have ever happened to him. Because he said he got up from the bed, went over to the record player, took that record and broke it into as many pieces as he could. And he said, he made a vow to himself. He said that from this day forward, these gifts, this capacity, is going to come under my control. It's not going to be something where it is at the beck and call of others. And so that began a very different phase for him. But the process that was really going on in his life at that particular time was this. It's something probably most of us are familiar with. The poet, I guess, describes it as the hounds of heaven, just sort of nipping at us, trying to move us to a new level of functioning. He was having this sort of experience, the hounds of heaven, divine discontent, no reason to be dissatisfied with his life. I mean, all of the trappings were there. But for some reason, something very deep and very urgent, he found missing. And again, these sorts of things started to come to him more and more. He found himself having to go more deeply into his meditation. And he started to get this sort of experience that is often spoken of, a kind of inward awareness of a guidance. That somehow or another there was something more that was guiding his way, or seeking to at least. And he started to make it more and more part of his process to try and make himself open to that. Which, at periods, that can be a dangerous thing, in the sense that change can be a dangerous thing. It's something we all invite with our mouth, but often recoil from when it actually comes upon us. But again, he's a very unusual man in many respects. And he reached a certain point where, again, on the surface, all was well. But he realized that he had to leave this life that he was living behind and begin something completely new. Now, probably a lot of us would have approached it differently than he did. I mean, the logical thing is to think of an exit strategy and, take your assets from your business and, parlay it into something. You know the strategies. Everybody reads the Wall Street Journal, or at least hears the business reports. His approach was a little bit different, in that one day he determined or it was determined that this is it. He walked away from his business, didn't make any arrangements for sale, nothing like that. Walked away from it, left everything as it was. The one thing he took from that business was the cash register, which he then donated to a local orphanage that was there. And he began a completely new phase. And it was a much more internal phase. It was one where really, I guess he would have gone into something similar to an extended type of retreat. But he started to really, really explore his inner life, and these sorts of gifts that he had started to really become quite awakened and quite active in his life, to the point that he really perceived a type of guidance that he systematically would make himself open to. And even though it might seem illogical, even though it might seem, like not the best advice, he would follow when he was aware that this sort of true guidance was speaking through him. So what it led him to do is this. This would be in like 1960s in Chicago. And I don't know if many of you are aware. I mean, this is almost ancient history by now. But back in the 1960s in Chicago, it was a situation in some ways similar to what we have now, where there were youth gangs in various areas of the city of Chicago that really had become quite pronounced. I mean, whole neighborhoods were essentially the fiefdoms of 15 and 18 and 21-year-olds. And there was warring between these various sorts of gang groups. That was one of the fixtures of many parts of Chicago, particularly the South Side and West Side in Chicago. So anyway, at a certain point, he is guided to move from where he was in the suburban area of Chicago to this one particular house, which I saw it after. The before picture, requires a good imagination, because it was this house that, to call it dilapidated would be glorifying it. I mean, it was something where the windows were broken out, the heating system had busted, and to top everything off, it was a frame home, so it was leaning about 10 inches on one side. And this was the place that he resisted this, but very clearly it kept coming to him. This is the place. So anyway, things work out. He buys the place, moves in, starts working on it. And this particular house, the way it's set, there were these three particular very strong gangs in this area. And they would make up names for themselves. There was the Warlords, there was another one called the Aishays at that time, and there was another one that called themselves the Disciples. A lot of them have morphed into other things, but this particular house sat right at the boundary where all of these three groups would contend. So the way it worked, you kind of laugh and you say, okay, these are 15 and 20-year-olds, but really the way it worked was much the way our nation states work today. That certain boundaries, if you were from this other place and you're caught on the other side, then that was no good for you. And they were constantly fighting over these boundaries. But his house was right where these three intersected. So he starts this process of trying to upgrade this house. He came from a rural community, and he was always used to having flower gardens, all the things that you have when you're out in the country. And wherever he lived, he would always have those. So he started to plant flowers. And neighbor, well-meaning lady, comes to him and says, Mr. Lawrence, I see what you're trying to do, But let me tell you, save your effort, because these kids in this neighborhood, they won't let anything grow. So he says, well, I'm going to have a flower garden. She says, well, you can try, but I'll be dead and gone before you grow flowers in this neighborhood. Because basically it was, that's the way it was at that time. Grown people would be sitting on their porches, sipping tea in the evenings, and as soon as it got to be dark, everybody would just roll up the porch practically and go back inside, because now the kids run the streets. And it was a difficult time. But what he started to do, he started to actually come in contact, started to meet these kids. They would be walking by, and a lot of these kids are very hypersensitive. So when this new person came into the neighborhood, and he clearly didn't look like the rest of the people in the neighborhood, they started to wonder about who he is. So they'd be coming around trying to check him out. And, sometimes he would call them aside. And one of the fellows, I knew him very well when I moved to Chicago. But at the time, he was one of these, heavy gangbangers. They used to call him Crazy Willie. Or they'd call him Pretty Willie, which was sort of, they would say it to be facetious, because Willie was, I'm sure God loved him, but he was a homely child in every respect. But he was a fellow who was deeply involved with this gang activity. And he always would have a little gun on him. He was probably 16 years old. And so he tells the story about how one time he was walking by, and the old man was working in his front yard. And he calls him over to him. He says, say, son, come here. And Willie's, the old man was telling me how Willie walked up, and his lips were tight, and, he's looking at him. What? Little guy. So he tells him, he says, look, I see where you and another boy, the other boy's brown skin, he's got a scar right here. I see where night before last you all shot somebody. And so Willie says, we didn't do that. He says, I see it, son. What I want you to do, the boy with the scar, bring him here. I want to talk to both of you. So they had actually done that. And he had described how they had done it, how they had been behind something and shooting at the guy. And so he goes to tell his accomplice. And when he tells him, the other guy's name was Romy. And he's telling him, no, Willie, you had to have told him, because nobody saw that. You must have told him. He says, look, I didn't tell him. He told me everything. He wants to talk to us. So anyway, they came. He talked. And not about, and he would talk very, very differently. But he talked to them about that. What started to happen was all of these really quite rough young people started to get word about this guy and about how he could see things, and about how, at first they thought maybe he's the police, but then they said, no, he's not the police, because nothing's happening to any of us. He's only telling us good things. And so they started to come around him. And he would talk with them. What he eventually did, he'd start them actually helping him to work around the house. They'd be there, and he'd show them about how using a hammer and nail, he'd help them jack that leaning building up. And they'd be working there. They'd be planting flowers. Planting flowers. In fact, the way he tells it, he said one day he was out there working in his garden, and at this point, he had just a glorious and beautiful flower garden. And his neighbor came out on her porch, the same one that told him he'd never have anything. She says, Mr. Lawrence, you have the most beautiful flowers. And he said he was bent over pulling weeds. He said he didn't even look up. He said, you mean you're not dead yet? And just went back to pulling weeds. But that was the effect. They started to help with something they had never done, never had done things to particularly encourage growth, to encourage life, to have any experience with flowers. But he went beyond that, because what he started to do actually was he started to have meetings at his house where he would call all of these different gangbangers together from the different gangs. And this is something that didn't happen, If you had them all there together in one place, it only meant one thing. There's going to be a shootout and a fight. But they would come to his house, and he would tell them, there's some ground rules here, first of all. And they'd come to the door. He said, first thing you need to know, there are 2 bad people in this house. He said, and I'm both of them. Your weapons, leave them here at the door. And so they say, you old man, I wouldn't do this for anybody but you. They pull out a gun, a knife, everything. And they'd lay it there. And by the time these meetings would start, they'd say, there'd be a pile, like armaments shipment worth of weapons right over here on the floor. And they'd come into the house, and then he'd start to talk to them. And, basically what he would talk to them about was what we might call the ageless wisdom, theosophy, the various wisdom teachings, but in a language that was completely understandable to 15 to 25-year-old gangbangers. Which basically, I think one mistake that's often made, it's very easy to fall into sort of like this judgment that, that these are, some way underprivileged, lacking in certain sort of opportunities. But a lot of these people who were involved in this gang activity were genuine and natural-born leaders. I mean, you think about it. The type of person it takes to be at the head of an organization of, 2, 3, 4, 500 people. It's not just something that was done through sheer violence. A lot of these people were really very, very sharp and very old souls. Very developed, but on some other level, lacking in a sort of guidance and a sort of exposure to another way of seeing. But when they came in contact with what the old man and with what he had to offer, a lot of these people just blossomed. But what he would do, he would sit them down and he'd talk to them. Again, ageless wisdom, but, let's step it down to the terms that we can understand. So he'd talk to them about karma, what we understand as karma. And it would be something like, you think about the flowers that we planted. Or you think about an apple tree. If you plant an apple seed, what do you get? An apple tree. And from that apple tree, what do you get? You get an abundance of fruit. And it's all apples. It's all according to that seed that you planted. And then he'd go into, you plant a seed of hate. You plant a seed of violence. You plant a seed of killing. All of these different seeds that you are planting. What do you expect to happen? And that they could see. What ended up happening was that out of this particular group of people, a lot of them took it upon themselves. Just like they had been leaders in terms of organizing these gangs and practicing the sort of violent takeover of the neighborhoods, they started to take it upon themselves as their role to become ambassadors of peace. So they would go out and they'd make all these treaties. They'd broker these truces. They'd do really remarkable things. And what you found was that in that particular area in the city of Chicago, whereas before this was like a real hotbed, but it became, one of those observed but unexplained phenomena that for whatever reason, the violence in this area just went down, went way, way down. And as I say, a lot of those fellows went on to become quite prominent in activities that are promoting peace, understanding. Again, old souls that needed to meet someone to set them on a different track. So that's one of the things that he was doing. Right around this time, too, is when he first came in contact with Theosophy and with the Theosophical Society. It was something that was really to change his life completely. Actually, the fellow that introduced him to the Theosophical Society was probably, without a doubt, to me, I view him as probably the most spiritual individual that I have had the pleasure to know in my lifetime. Older gentleman by the name of Sandy J. Mack. Wonderful man of some humble means. He died, Mack probably died 15, 17 years ago. He was over 100 years old when he died. But he would tell you that he's a person who, he says, I'm not good looking, and I'm not smart like a lot of these guys, like Bill, like you, Tim. He would whenever you were with Mack, the brightest and the best and the highest qualities within you is what he would always speak to. He was remarkable for that. I had never seen him with anybody that he couldn't find something absolutely remarkable about you. That was true. But he talked about, I'm not good looking and I'm not that smart, so my hold card is the truth. I go with the truth. And not the truth in terms of, I don't like your shoes or something like that. The truth in terms of the higher truths that we all share. But anyway, he introduced the old man to the Theosophical Society. I should say, too, I keep saying the old man. He got this name right around this time with all of these kids he was working with. Because there was one real tall, skinny kid, and he would always tell him, Larry, you look just like a string bean. So everyone started calling him Bean. So he said, well, you're calling me Bean, you're calling me Bean. Let's all call him the old man. Because, of course, he was old, very old to them. He was probably about 48, ancient. So he was an old guy. So they started calling him the old man. But he met Mack. He came in touch with the Theosophical Society, went out to the actual national headquarters, and when he got there, he said he really had this sort of feeling that this was someplace he had been before. That feeling that probably some of us have had of finally coming home, I guess, is how he would say it. And it's at that point that really he would say that the sort of jigsaw puzzle of his life, all of these pieces really, really started to fit together. And it's right at that same time, too, that he started to have a different sort of vision that kept pestering him. And it was about a move to another house. And he had no inclination, no money to do it, none of that. But this particular vision of this house kept coming up. The way it worked out was it was something that he gradually, he found this particular house, and one thing led to another. There's so many stories here that I have to really kind of pick and choose which way to go with all of this. But he ends up in this house. And as I said, it's at that point where another group of people, he kept working with the people who were, all of the gang guys. I know them all quite well. And but a whole other group of people was drawn in at that point, and I happened to come in on that particular wave. This would have been like 1972, 73. The house he moved into was a very far cry from the other one. It was built to be the Japanese consulate at the time that it was built. 16-room mansion that had gone down. Again, it was in south side of Chicago, an area that used to be called the Black Belt, in the sense that it was the largest concentration of African-American population in Chicago and, well, certainly in Chicago. But it was this concentration that developed. And so along with that, a lot of the buildings that had been built, a lot of the people had left and left them to next wave that came in. So the way I happened to meet the old man, because really I wasn't, if you were to have asked me, I certainly would not have told you that I was looking for theosophy, the Theosophicals, any of that it had to offer. I was out as a sophomore in college on vacation, and I lived in New York. But I had a cousin who I'd been very close to, but I hadn't seen in a couple of years, who lived in Chicago. And I had an opportunity to come visit with him. So I went. And, my reasons for going were the reasons that you might attribute to, a 19-year-old with time on his hands, going to visit a cousin who, my memory of Barrett was a pretty wild guy. Somebody who liked the good life, 19-year-old style. So I said, okay, this is going to be a good vacation. So I get there, and it doesn't take me too long to see that something's changed here. My cousin was from his parents were very wealthy background, and they'd given him way too much, which also made it kind of nice. But I come to visit him, and, I'm with him, and I'm noticing that he's talking differently. The main difference was that the things when he was talking, it actually made sense. It was like good common sense, and this wasn't the guy I remembered. He talked about meditation, and I'm saying, what is this? And then he had this practice. We'd wake up in the morning, and I'd get up and hear Barrett, who always would sleep until whatever time in the day. I'd get up and hear he'd be sitting in the corner, and he's, basically sitting, looking at the wall, with his eyes closed, though. And I lay in bed and I'd watch him. I kind of open one eye and just see what he's doing. And he wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there. And I'm thinking, of all the odd things, this talking common sense is one thing, but just sitting down not moving? So finally I said to him, Barrett, what's up? He said, well, I'm meditating. Oh, I see. And I didn't. So he says, here, he gives me a little book to read about it. It didn't particularly interest me. But I said, Barrett, you have definitely changed since I saw you last. And what's behind that? He says, well, Tim, you need to meet my teacher, the old man. And I have to tell you, obviously I'd had this plan for a really enjoyable time in Chicago. And it was, it was declining, but it wasn't to the point where it was past saving yet. But when he tells me that I need to meet, first of all, his teacher, and all of those I had left behind at school, I thought. I wasn't coming here to meet a teacher. Neither was I coming out to Chicago to meet an old man. I said, this vacation is lost. Just do what you will. So he brings me by the old man. And, I was prepared to be underwhelmed by this fellow. My mind was just set. First of all, I didn't really want to be there. So I got there, and, we sit down for about 45 minutes or so. And true to my expectations, I was underwhelmed. And I was a little happy about that. Finally, I'm right about something out here in Chicago. He talked some interesting things, nothing particular that stuck. One thing that did stick was that while we were there, one of the people that had come with us, he was having a headache. He's just rubbing his head while he's sitting there, and he couldn't really get into it. So the old man calls to him. He says, Al, it looks like you're in some pain. He says, yeah, old man, I'm having a headache. So he looks, he says, Larry, Calvin, take Al's headache. And so they take a chair and put it out in the middle of the room, say, here, Al, sit down. They said, take Al's headache. I was looking for the usual thing, Someone was going to go get him a Tylenol and a glass of water. But they put a chair in the middle of the floor. One stands in front, one stands behind. They rub their hands together. Just hold it like that. Don't touch him. Maybe 30 seconds. Shake their hands and go back and sit down. And Al gets up, he says, wow, man, that feels so much better. You know, what do I do with that? You know, I didn't know what to do. I saw something, but I didn't see anything. But clearly he was relieved. I mean, he wasn't just acting about his relief. So anyway, I just kind of let that go. I didn't have any particular mental box to put it in. I just let it float. Finally comes time to leave. And I'm coming to the door. Everybody's filing past the old man, you know, bye, see you later. And my turn comes, and I'm going by. I say, well, it's been nice meeting you. I said, goodbye. So he looks at me, and he says, I'll see you soon, son. And at that point, I had really had enough. You know, my 19-year-old arrogance just came to its fully blown peak. And I said, I don't think so. I don't think you will see me soon, because I have to leave early in the morning tomorrow, very early. So I doubt I'll see you. And he just smiles, and he says, I'll see you soon, son. And I leave. We get back to my cousin's house. And when we get there, something I had brought with me is missing. And so we're looking for it. Can't find it. I look everywhere. And then I ask him, I say, Barrett, do you know what happened? He says, well, no, Tim, I don't. But we should probably go ask the old man. And, you know, it's just like, it was unending. This made absolutely no sense. And finally, I had to just tell Barrett. I said, look, at this point, I think you've gone a little bit too far. You know, what street are we on now? You know, I was going to educate him. I said, what street is this that we're on? He said, we're on 87th Street. I said, and where? A lawyer, you know, in the making. Where does the old man live? 33rd Street. I said, yeah, 33rd Street, 87th Street. What is he going to know about this? And I never will forget the way he looked at me, because you know, I've seen that look before. You know, growing up in New York, you would often have people who would be kind of just wandering down the street with bags and might be just looking up, talking to someone, and there's no one there. And you know, people walk by and they give that kind of look like, poor soul. And Barrett was looking at me like that. So anyway, I let that pass. I thought I had made my point. But sure enough, you know, we're going around that evening, and just finally the vacation gets a little bit enjoyable. We're going to visit different people. When later on in the evening, we pull up in front of this house. And I really didn't know Chicago at that time, so I didn't know where we were driving, but I recognized this house as the place we had been earlier in the day, where the old man lived. Yeah. And so we walk in, ring the doorbell, and one of the fellows who was staying there brings us upstairs. And the old man's in his bedroom. He had had a surgery, and he really had used a lot of energy when he came down to visit us that afternoon. So he was just laying down. So we walk in the room, and as soon as we walk in, he looks at me, he says, hey, we meet again. And that's when I remembered that he had, earlier in the day, he had told me this. And then he told me, he said, the thing you came here to ask me about, you'll get your answer when you get back to New York. And from that, the conversation switched completely to where he just started talking. Really, he was talking about theosophy, about the ageless wisdom, about who you are as opposed to who you think and pretend yourself to be. And he started to go very deep into this. And as if he had to make the point any further, he really started to tell me in very, very graphic detail specific occurrences in my own life that he had no possible way of knowing in an ordinary sense. But you know, at that point, I didn't need to be impressed by the fact that he could, in fact, see. But he talked to me, and he talked for a while, and I listened. And you know, at different points, at one point he stopped and he said, you know, son, I want to share something with you. He said, it's a mantra. You know, something, it's a saying that I made for myself. And I want to share it with you. You think about it, and it might do you some good. So he shared this mantra with me, his own creation. And the way it went was, I know that I am a spark from that eternal flame. I'm a grain of sand on this beach of life. I am related to a blade of grass, correlated to a leaf on a tree. I'm part of the universal all. What can be denied me? He says, that's my mantra, son. And, you know, he kept talking. And so at a certain point, he says, you know, it's time for you to get up and go. And I said, no, man, you don't have to stop. Please keep on. He said, no, you better go. Because don't you remember? I said, remember what? You have to leave early in the morning. I said, that's right, we have time. He said, look at your watch. And I looked at my watch, and I had been sitting there fully 4 hours and hadn't noticed any passage of time. It already was early the next morning. So I leave. I go back to New York. On the way home, driving back, I can't really say I was fully thinking about the things he had said. It was really too much. I couldn't process. It wasn't breaking through. But it was this sort of feeling like, you know, probably you've all had this sort of feeling where you really don't feel like you're here, but you're not fully there, and you know, just this sort of feeling of being in between. Get back to New York, and I have a little bit of time before I have to go back to school. So I said, well, I'm going to go out and walk in the park and just kind of think about this stuff. So I did. So I go walking in the park. And I'm walking out there, and I'm thinking about this mantra. Just something popped into my head. You know, while I had been in Chicago, my cousin had given me this book on, it was like on yoga, to explain something about meditation. And as I said, I opened it and I read maybe a paragraph, and nothing hit me. But the one paragraph that I read at that moment came back to me. And that paragraph was specifically about breathing and the breath. It was about the in-breath, the out-breath. And so I started just focusing on the in-breath, the out-breath, thinking about I'm a grain of sand on this beach of life. And that's when something happened. And, you know, I'm not going to attempt to really describe what happened because I can't. I can talk to you about the after effects, but while walking, you know, there was this sort of feeling that really, it was just like in these movies in a way, where walking, all of a sudden, it's as if everything around me got to be very, very quiet, very still. And this is New York City. But you know, there's not a sound, and this intense silence. And then I started to walk down this flight of steps, and what happened was that really in the time it took me to put one foot down, to take the next step, really something opened up. And I saw something. That's the only way I can express it. But it was something that was, later I would come to read about people who had had mystical experiences, and you know, I said, that's it. But that's what happened at that time. And you know, out of that, as I say, there were a number of sort of like side effects associated with that. But from that point on, it became very clear, you know, that there was a great deal more to life than I had ever dreamed previously. Many of the pieces started to fit together, and I started to really understand at a much deeper level. This sort of heightened experience was something that stayed with me for about a couple of weeks, actually, and then died down. And when it died down, it was probably the most miserable experience I could have imagined. I mean, imagine, 2 weeks of dwelling in the heaven worlds, and then all of a sudden you're back to where you started off, except you know that there's more. So it's at that time that I really determined to get back, make a connection, and get back to Chicago. I realized that I had, this experience had really been generated by my contact with the old man. And so it was time to get back. And so right at this time is when I was coming there. There were people who were gathering from all over the place. Many people had met him and had similar sorts of things to happen. And again, out of that, healing teams were formed. There were a lot of work that was done. A lot of young musicians started to flock around. It got to the point where every Wednesday night there would be meetings, and musicians from all over Chicago would come. And it wouldn't end until way in the morning hours. And all of these were, again, musicians who were believing that their music had a potency to heal. And they felt that somehow they could deepen that. And they did, and many of them went on to become quite prominent. A lot of things I could talk about. Again, it's just a matter of picking and choosing what sorts of stories to share with you. But just to say that the experience with the old man, I moved out there. Actually, I went out there for 3 months. I was going to take a term off from school. 3 months at this point has gone to about 34 years, so it stretched a little. My timetable was a little off, but at that time I was thinking, well, if I met him once and this thing happened, if I go for 3 months, it'll be permanent. But it wasn't like that. It's a path that you get glimpses of, and the glimpses serve to give you motivation to deepen. But as I say, there are a lot of stories could share about the old man's life. Probably, it'd be best to say he died in 1987. Around him a community had formed. The community went on for about 14, 15 years after the time that he died. It grew. Gradually, people started to have different areas of their own life that they wanted to pursue. And so that's something that had its time and has since ceased. But the takeaway, what is it? You hear a story about a man like this, and it can be a couple of different things. At the very least, I hope it was interesting and perhaps even entertaining. That has some value in and of itself. It's good to spend 45 minutes, an hour to forget about our problems, hearing about a story about a remarkable person. So that's good. But I think probably there's something more there. It would be very easy to say, in the case of a person like Bill Lawrence, or people of that ilk, that it's a remarkable story, inspiring, but really it doesn't really apply to me because after all, I wasn't born clairvoyant. I didn't have this sort of background, so it's interesting. And I think that would be a mistake. Because to me, actually I was around him so much, as I say, for 13 years. And for a while, early on, I thought, really, I want to be just like this man. What I see in him, that's what I want to see for me. And here's how I was playing it at that time. The old man his hair started to gray, and he liked, he liked the Grecian formula. He would dye his hair black, wanted to keep the look that he had. So he's dyeing his hair black. I said, okay. I dyed my hair black. The old man would wear a suit. We'd all fall out. We'd all be just as sharp as can be. 19 and 18-year-olds, we're supposed to be in jeans. But the sort of imitation of the outer was a phase in that. But then I started to really understand this. The question is, what is it that actually made him the person that he is? And it had nothing to do with his look or his style. He had something that was uniquely his own. What it had to do with was a couple of things. The first thing was that he was so completely and fully himself, so authentic, that that was something that carries across. The other thing that comes out of it is this. Goethe is said to have said that commitment, that when we commit ourselves, when we surrender ourselves to something, providence moves also. The quote they attribute to Goethe is, "Whatever you can do or whatever you believe you can do, act now. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." What I take away from this is this. During our time together here, we've had an opportunity to hear about a number of very pressing needs within our human family and within the planet as a whole. No mistake about it. Nobody is so blind that we don't see that. The problem we often fall into is, of course, that the problems are so much bigger than I am. It's overwhelming. And, the paralysis of analysis sets in. But it does seem that wherever you find it, whenever we're able to actually surrender, to turn ourselves over, that there is, in fact, a power that ensouls our actions. And you see it. Bill Lawrence could have been just another guy who sees a few things and can make some money. And that could have been the end of his story, a nice guy to have known. Except for that other element. And that element is something that we, in fact, share. So, what I would say is this. For each of us, certainly, even if we came to this conference feeling in some way that we didn't have, a handle on avenues in which we can plug in to make this world a better place, that has been dispelled over the course of the day, certainly. We know that there are areas where we can bring our special and unique gifts to serve. The only thing that's required at this point is to say a simple word, which is yes. Yes, I will. Yes, I will turn myself over to something more that is really seeking to speak through me at this moment, and to do it willingly. And then to just be able to play the role of the bystander, just to really kind of watch as the magic, the power, the genius that Goethe spoke about starts to appear through your life and in the areas in which you shine your life. That's the takeaway for me.